Welcome, Ms. Peters. I have to say I find myself a bit mystified by the comments that Senator Durbin made earlier. He talked about seeking stiffer penalties for prisoner abuse cases. Of course, no prisoner should be abused, and if a prison guard is found guilty of doing so after being afforded due process of law, I'd favor them facing stiff penalties. One of the main reasons we impose stiff penalties, of course, is because it has a deterrent effect. And Senator Durbin and many of the other Democrats in this committee, like Senator Booker, seem to have a very selective view of when deterrence comes into play. Just yesterday, in fact, Senator Durbin blocked bills on the floor that would impose stiffer penalties for fentanyl, which is poisoning children all across America. Bills that I offered, bills that Senator Grassley offered. Senator Booker has repeatedly offered or blocked my legislation that would permanently schedule fentanyl under the Controlled Substance Act. So our Democratic friends seem to have a very curious and selective view of when stiff penalties will have an actual deterrent effect. Now, let me move on, Ms. Peters. This is your first appearance before the committee since this is not a Senate-confirmed position. So I'd like to ask you a couple basic questions that nominees for the committee always get asked. I assume you would agree that it's important for you and executive branch officials to be responsive to requests from Congress for information?
Yes, sir.
And I would assume that you also agree that it's important for you and executive branch officials to be responsive to requests from the public if information is requested properly under the Freedom of Information Act. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Well, the reason I ask is that because at the beginning of the pandemic, Congress passed the CARES Act, the first major coronavirus response bill, which gave temporary authority to the Bureau of Prisons to allow some inmates to serve out part of their sentences at home until the pandemic ended or until the availability of vaccines meant that prisoners could again be housed in a secure location. But jailbreak activists, to include so-called progressive criminal justice reformers, asked the Biden administration to twist the law and have the Bureau use the pandemic as an excuse to release as many inmates as possible and never return them to prison and to finish their sentences after the pandemic ended. I know that this was before you started, but it was publicly reported that those jailbreak activists asked the Department of Justice to rewrite the law to achieve their soft-on-crime goals. Now, the department is proposing a new rule that would give the Bureau of Prisons authority to release tens of thousands of additional criminals and not require them to serve their sentences. This would not only be an enormous mistake in the middle of a crime wave, it would also be illegal. In January, I sent Attorney General Merrick Garland a letter to provide the exact same information that he would be required by law to provide any interested member of the public. That is, written copies of communications and meeting records between the Biden administration and these jailbreak activists where they discuss policy. This week, more than 8 months later, one of the Attorney General's underlings finally sent a cursory response providing exactly none of that information. I say this simply as a cautionary tale. I hope that you will be more responsive than the Attorney General, who has politicized the department, who seems unable to stand up to far left-wing activists in his own department and to enforce the law neutrally, at the same time that he sicks the feds on parents at school boards or send armed agents into a Catholic minister's home, a man named Matt Hoke, when he had agreed already to cooperate with any investigation into his supposed crimes. Now, the Attorney General is going to have a reckoning whenever he faces a Republican Congress in January. I hope, though, that you will simply cooperate with timely requests for information from members of Congress and from the public. Now, Ms. Peters, on a related point, I want to note that the President said just a couple weeks ago, the pandemic is over. Is President Biden wrong?
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate the cautionary tale about being responsive. We certainly want to be as responsive as we can at the Bureau of Prisons to both members of Congress requests and also that of the general public. As we pivot out of the pandemic and really focus on kind of a future state as it relates to the pandemic, we do have that rule under review that will give the Bureau guidance on those individuals that were released on home care confinement. We're hoping to see what that rule looks like here in the coming weeks, and I look forward to reviewing it when it's finalized.
So, Ms. Peters, is the President wrong? Is the pandemic over or not over?
Senator, I am not a health professional. I would not be able to make that
But it's part of your job as the director of the bureaus to ensure that our prisons can adapt to pandemic conditions. Do you know how many criminals are currently serving their sentence at home who should be in the prison?
I don't have that number in front of me, Senator.
It's over 11,000. That includes 647 gun criminals, bomb makers, and other weapons criminals. 13 murderers. 5,870 drug traffickers. Are you certain that not a single one of those criminals who are serving their sentence at home are currently engaged in criminal activity?
Thank you, Senator. I could never make that certain determination.
I don't think anyone could. In fact, I'm pretty certain that at least one of them is, probably a lot of them. Thanks, Ms. Peters.
Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, my friend Tom Cotton mentioned my name. May I make a small response?
Oh, yeah.
Without objection.
So first of all, I don't object to scheduling. Fentanyl has been scheduled for, it is scheduled. You're talking about fentanyl analogs, and we should be specific about that. The scientific community has said we should test things before we schedule them, but you've actually won. For the last 4 years, fentanyl analogs have been temporarily scheduled. So what you're saying is not true. And the second thing that I want to say is 4 years of doing what you want to do, which is permanently scheduling, 4 years of scheduling fentanyl, has actually not seen the response that we want. We are in this nation seeing this overwhelming fentanyl crisis. And Mr. Chairman, we're trying to just do the same things we've been doing that caused mass incarceration in the first place, but didn't actually make us safer, as we've seen with the problem with fentanyl. So I'm happy to work on a real solution. Right now, again, for the record, fentanyl is scheduled. Fentanyl analogs are scheduled, and the crisis is getting worse. So we know there are a lot of things we could be doing to solve this problem, but having people beat their chest to try to create more and higher mandatory minimums or more and more scheduling when things are already done, that's just posturing. What we need to do is solve this crisis in America and come together in a bipartisan way to make this nation safer, and not to rhetoric that's just not true when this nation already has fentanyl scheduling, fentanyl analogs are scheduled, but the problem is getting worse.
It's not just a permanent scheduling. Yesterday, Senator Durbin blocked Senator Grassley's mere 14-month scheduling. The simple fact of the matter is, Democrats will not take this seriously unless they get something in return, like more violent felons released from prison. So I'm happy to have this debate on the floor later today. I have a stack of letters right here from parents whose children were killed by fentanyl sent to Senator Booker, and I'm more than happy to go to the floor and read those into the record if we want to.
Again, I'm sorry, but that's just not true. This partisan rhetoric, this partisan warfare, that we all don't have people in all of our states who are dying from this crisis. And so what he's asking for is already done. We have fentanyl scheduled right now, but more and more people are dying. Why can't we come together? Because there are a lot of Republican groups that I work with, a lot of Republican think tanks that I work with, that have real solutions to this crisis of people dying. I would never accuse my colleague, Tom Cotton, of not caring about dead children. We both have hearts. I know your heart. So to accuse me of that is outrageous. I literally run a city where people are dying from these drugs, and all I hear often is the same things we've been doing for 25 years or on the drug war that just are increasing incarceration, not helping. We're going to hear from people here who are addicted. Let's find real solutions and stop accusing ourselves in partisan warfare of things that just aren't true. Right now, fentanyl is scheduled. We've been extending that scheduling over and over again, but this problem is going worse. I'd love to work with my colleagues on things that are actually going to solve the problem, and not just the rhetoric that works good for partisan left-right debates, but doesn't work for actually saving the lives that we need to save. I'm tired of this ridiculous partisanship. Let's solve problems and not stop accusing each other of not having hearts. You're a good man, I'm a good man. Let's see if we can come together and actually solve some problems.
I didn't accuse you of anything in your heart. I said the obvious and predictable consequences of the policies you and your party support are the fact that we are now at, not mass incarceration, but a 21-year low in the number of inmates in federal prisons. We are not at a 21-year low in the number of overdoses in this country. We are at record highs. Almost twice as many people die every single year. from drug overdoses as died in the Vietnam War.
And just look at Right on Crime. Look at the organization called Right on Crime. I'm sorry, this is the last thing I'll say. You're creating not a real correlation. You know this. Just years ago, we were seeing drops in these things, which didn't necessarily correlate. In fact, southern states, red states, that were lowering their prison rates also saw a concomitant lower in crime. Your science is reckless. And if you really want to have a substantive conversation and dialogue on this, I'm open to doing it anytime. I'll come to your office. Heck, I'll fly to your state. Let's figure out how to solve this problem. And I'll use the data that is collected by right-wing organizations that point to things that work and things that are posturing.
We're going to return to the regular order. I'm not going to respond to the senator from Arkansas's personal reference to me.